Hi, comrades. Thank you for joining us for the Red Nation podcast. My name is Jen Marley. Today, we're going to be talking about Native horror. But before that, I just want to remind you, if you haven't yet, to please subscribe to our Patreon. Our Patreon subscribers really keep the heart of Red Nation and Red Media beating. So thank you again so much for those of you who have subscribed. And we're going to be releasing even more content, even more bonus content. So it'll be worth the subscription for sure. But yeah, let's get into it. We're here with Kaylee Simmons. She's a literary theorist and she specializes in Native horror. I don't know if that's how you got your start, but yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. I know a lot of people are excited for this conversation. I've been telling people, yeah, we're going to do an episode on Native horror, and everyone's really into it because a lot of Natives are into horror, as we know. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think that is? Why do you think that Natives have such a unique relationship to horror, and what makes it unique? What is the appeal?
But before you answer that question, can you introduce yourself too?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Yeah. Getting ahead of myself.
Hi, I'm Kaylee Simmons. I'm Oglala Lakota from Pine Ridge. I'm a professor of Indigenous Nation Studies at Portland State University. Yeah. Howdy. So why do Natives have such an interesting relationship to horror? So there's like two reasons, right? So first is that a lot of our communities have, right, these beings that, and we have this storytelling history and present, keep telling stories that has a lot of creepy stuff in it. Like I remember this summer I was listening to some recordings by some Zoom meetings that the tribe was doing with elders, and the elder was talking about, there's this his grandma worried about shadow people from underground sneaking in, right, and replacing people. So you had to check to make sure that the people that you were the right person, right? And there's all sorts of other stories like that that exist across tribes, right? And then the other thing is that a lot of us have encountered really horrifying things that in many ways, I talk about horror sometimes as like a what if. So what if somebody came and kidnapped your whole family? Or what if somebody came and did something to you or to a family member that fundamentally transformed who they are, and then you have to live with them, right? And that's not a what if for many Native people. That's a reality, right? And then I think another reason is historically, at least for me, and I've told this story before, is that there isn't a lot of Native representation in horror, but there are stories that if you kind of read them sideways enough, you can identify with certain characters, and sometimes those characters are the monsters in horror movies. So right when I was younger, when I watched Alien, I was like, wow, Ripley's such a badass, great heroic, lady figure. But as I grew up and started to think about my indigeneity in different ways, I was like, man, I'm kind of more like the xenomorph, right? Because it's like a Native matriarch protecting land that is being invaded by a colonizing force. She has this sexuality that everyone is very, very confused about. And that is very threatening to a lot of the male white dude characters in that movie. So I think, it's a combination of factors of already having these stories in our communities. And then it's a sort of, affinity based on having to engage creatively with the media representation that we're given.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to think about how the most entertaining genre of Indigenous storytelling, at least for me, which is horror stories, is also the least written about and performed, in a good way, Mm-hmm. And that has to do with many things, but let's get into some of these tropes. And you talk about this in a lot of your work, and I think the most common trope is the Indian burial ground. I mean, this is how Stephen King made his career, right? We're talking about Land Back, Stephen King's mansion. You know, he owes it to Native people because he's like used this trope over and over again, even if it's not present. Like if it's not just like the so literal, like in Pet Sematary, you know, it's an Indian burial ground. It's like in The Shining, or it's like it's always kind of you know, in proximity to what's going on the page or in the.
Yeah, I mean, I try to avoid talking about the Indian burial ground trope in my work because it's been talked to death, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to. And now in my book, I realize I have to write a whole chapter about it, and so I've acquiesced to that. That we need, you know, further rebuttals to this. Joey Clift, who's a Cowlitz writer, comedian, was on the Dead Meat podcast. Shout out to him. And he talked about this trope. So I think, you know, there's another place to go to for more insight from a Native perspective, right? And so there he says, you know, there's this, it's sort of this idea, right, that, you know, Native people are mystical, that we're so, I think the way he says it is like, we're so out of this world that we're like otherworldly. And then it's this, like you're alluding to, Nick, this like repressed guilt over dispossession that settlers are having a really hard time coming to terms with. And I think, another way to think about it is, you know, by representing people, Native people, as ghosts, that's a way to sort of process the guilt without thinking about actual living Native people, right? It's a way to put colonialism into a system of the past rather than something that people are still participating in now through, you know, all sorts of means.
So one trope you don't shy away from is the final girl. We read your article. That's a review of My Heart is a Chainsaw. And I really like the way you took that up and talking about how in some cases, you know, Indigenous women might resonate with the final girl as somebody who defends herself or someone who's fighting back. But at the same time, that can also reinforce harmful tropes about, you know, policing women's sexualities or being objectified. And so I thought about Prey when I was reading that. And I was just wondering if you could talk more about that trope and what it means to Native people and, you know, how Native women, you know, find themselves relating or not relating to the final girl.
Yeah, I mean, I really love Stephen for writing that book. Because that's, you know, I'm 30 years old now. I'm 30 years old, and and there's a new generation of Native folks that are able to see themselves in media, and that book, My Heart is a Chainsaw, is like the first time I saw myself in media. And so I tell, you know, my students that because I'm like, we had to wait until we were like 30, 40, until we finally got a story that that had us in it. So be thankful that this work that got done. So like the conceit of that story, right, is the main character Jade is obsessed, is a Native woman. She's obsessed, Native young girl, obsessed with horror, and she is obsessed with the final girl, but she has experienced things in her life that sort of preclude her from fully fitting into that archetype, because the final girl, for folks who don't know, is, you know, the one who survives the slasher. They're usually, you know, virginal. They're like the nerdy, bookish one. Sometimes they're, you know, more masculine in some ways. So like a Ripley, you know, whose name is even a kind of like has a sort of certain gendered connotation to it, right? And that for many reasons, Jade like doesn't fit into that archetype. And so the whole book, she sort of struggles with her not being able to realize that she is the final girl of the story, but because this sort of standard has been set that she can't fulfill, it causes her a lot of pain. And when I started doing work in horror, there's this really famous book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is where that term, the final girl, comes from, by this woman, Carol Clover, that she first theorizes that. The book is really great and compelling, and for me was also surprising because it was written in like 1992 and actually uses the word settler in it and talks about colonialism, which for me was surprising because that's like, for someone not working in indigenous studies to be using that term and to be thinking about that stuff that early on, I found really interesting. But in any case, one of the main things that doesn't get brought up in that book, and I don't think it's brought up in a lot of discussions about the final girl, is that the final girl is always white. And that seems to be also another essential component of this archetype that we haven't come to terms with. And so the other thing that I think is important, aside from the final girl's whiteness, is that in Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Carol Clover says, the slasher is a really unique genre because it's one of the few genres that forces a presumably sort of young male audience to identify with someone who's of a different gender. And for me as I don't know if I'm a literary scholar. I aspire to be a literary scholar. I know that looking into early American literature, that's absolutely not the first genre that has asked men to identify with young women. The captivity narrative is. And so that once I sort of saw that linky, I couldn't unsee it. And if you go back to those early captivity narratives, for me, I see a lot of resonances with those characters like a Mary Rowlandson, that with final girls, right? They are taken out of their status quo is disrupted. They are forced to witness a lot of violence that part of the experience is like they retell this graphic violence that Native people supposedly did. And the, part of the purpose of that was for like the titillation of the reader, right? And then it also had, of course, a propagandic aspect, right? The idea was to perpetuate this notion that indigenous people were just like violent murderers. And so, like I said, that's another thing that I can't unsee about the final girl once I've sort of made that connection. And the more you look into it, the more I just see the resonances of those characters sort of carried into contemporary final girls. So now that I know that, or now that I think that, it's really hard for me to identify with the final girl in the ways that I used to be able to. And I think what it shows, and what I think indigenous horror does really well, is that it doesn't just put like Native women, like My Heart is a Chainsaw, for example. Stephen just doesn't put like a Native woman into a plot of a slasher. A whole bunch of things change in that book that make it very, very unconventional. And I think in those changes to convention, what he shows is that, the final girl is an archetype that like is fundamentally exclusionary of indigenous people. And that, in a way can be read as one of those tools. And Carol Clover says this too, to get white women to participate in colonial white supremacist heteropatriarchal structures. Because, if you can fight, you can survive, you can wield violence, you can be the hero, so long as you're doing it in a way that is destructive to indigenous peoples or any sort of other that's threatening to the status quo, right? So that's my skepticism of the final girl.
It's really interesting. And it makes me think about how even in like the newer, and Jen and I are going to do a podcast episode on the newer versions of the Halloween series of the franchise, where Laurie is the final girl. And in the not really the remakes, but the sequels to Halloween 1978, she has to live with the trauma of being, the final girl, but also all the broken relationships that she has and the strained relationships she has as a woman, a white woman, to her own children. She's like in survival mode all the time because of the violence that she's experienced after being attacked by this, figure, Michael Myers, who haunts her, even though he's like in jail. But also, she has to live with, you know, the kind of reality of being the final girl and the trauma that comes with that. And I just think it's like a weird inversion of like how, in this sense, it's like white people are like the traumatized subjects, and specifically like white motherhood is broken, when in fact it's quite the opposite for Native people, where it's like Native families are literally ripped apart by just not even Michael Myers, but just the very kind of quotidian nature of settler colonialism itself.
Mm-hmm. And it's that's the other resonance with Final Girls, that is one of those continuities that into contemporary horror that I find really interesting, is that in most cases, in the case of Mary Rowlandson, it's up for debate, like whether a guy actually, Increased Matter, this Puritan guy, actually wrote the whole narrative. But there's other cases where he like did write whole captivity narratives. But it's this way for white masculinity to think through these questions using white women as this kind of image or figure. And it's the same with contemporary horror, where it's more often than not still white men writing these narratives, and trying to think through this problem of like gender, the gender binary, and the ways colonialism has produced gender in relationship to whiteness. It's weird.
Do you think that the final girl is kind of like this rewriting of the way the white woman symbolizes like the sanctity of U.S. nationhood that we saw portrayed in Westerns, but for like a new generation, right? Like in the post-Western era. Do you think the final girl is kind of like this rearticulation of like, the famous manifest destiny angel, like being threatened and overcoming and defending herself as a stand-in for defending like the settler state? Or is that a stretch?
No, yeah, I think, the fact that this figure still keeps coming up shows that white women play a really important psychological part in the settler psychology, I guess, is the way to say it. And yeah, what's interesting is those narratives that we see in like The Searchers, for example. The Searchers takes from the captivity narrative, from that plot that predates the Western. This notion of like the white woman held captive by, at first, the Native American and then Michael Myers, is just a trope that continues and seems to continue to serve an important purpose. Even though the stories shift around a little bit, the fact that fundamental convention has continued across time tells me something alarming is happening, or something alarming isn't happening.
It makes me think that like some of the first films about Native people were always Westerns, like the movie Battle of, I think it's Mulberry Gulch, which is a film that was, I'm trying to think of that guy's name. He did a Birth of a Nation. He's the KKK guy. I can't remember his name at the top of my head.
We've purged it from our minds.
I don't know.
As an act of healing.
It's weird because like I took this culture theory class and they were talking. We had to watch Birth of a Nation, and the guy was the professor was like, "Oh, these scenes are so wonderful," and I was like, "This is violent Klan propaganda. Like, what are you talking about?" But anyways, these kind of early silent films, there's a lot of Westerns in them, but also I think in your work you point out that there's also a lot of like horror that has like Native themes, and it's almost as if these two kind of genres of film and entertainment, or just genres of fiction, kind of emerge, and they're almost inseparable in some ways in the U.S. and Canada, at least U.S. horror, because it seems to be very much ingrained, like as you're saying with like the final girl, it's like very much has colonial origins.
Sorry, I'm blanking. Can you reformulate the question?
Sure. No, I was just, sorry, that wasn't even scripted. It was just, I was just thinking about how, like even The Searchers itself, it has the very same tropes that like a native horror or like films that feature native people have, or native motifs or whatever. They use the same tropes, and in some ways it's like as if the US Western is kind of like the, I don't know, the archetype of pretty much every like US popular culture, even as it tries to move away. Like you think of war films, they use the same tropes as the Western. Like I'm thinking of like American Sniper, for example, or even I can't remember that other one. It was about the assassination of Osama bin Laden. Yeah, Zero Dark 30. That's like it's like a classic Western. You know, the drama, the suspense. You're going into enemy territory. I mean, his code name Geronimo. You know, you have all these motifs. That's what I was kind of thinking about in terms like, and I can't, having watched a lot of Westerns, not like by choice, but like in a critical way. That's how I watch horror movies now, specifically U.S. horror movies, not outside of the United States, but specifically like U.S. horror movies. I can't see them outside the lens of Westerns.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a list that I'm gathering for my book of, I think I'm calling it the movies that are about Indians that that try to say that they're not about Indians. And so like an example of one of those is like The Hills Have Eyes, right? The original 70s one. And then the remake is, I don't even know how to make sense of that. But like there's no indigenous people in that film, or even something like Deliverance, right? Like those are captivity narratives, but in the 70s for some reason, I mean, in the 70s because there was, you know, people were starting to make noise about, you know, the bad representations of Native people, that there's this weird shift to making the violence like intra-racial violence, like white people from the country fighting white people from the city. But you can't tell that story without the history of colonialism, right? Because the way those spaces get mapped out are through colonization, right? The association of rurality with a sort of descent into savagery. So that's why, yeah, like for me, The Hills Have Eyes is like such a weird movie, because even, and there it's like even blatant because, right, you have like the character of Ruby is like in a buckskin outfit, and then the remake is stranger too, and is stranger and makes a point, I think, on accident that I find really interesting. So the remake sort of recodes the whole family through the language of disability, which for me then shows that there's a relationship between how people think about indigeneity and how people think about disability. So for me, that comes through in law, right? The fact that we are these sort of wards of the state, that we're like incapable of managing our own affairs, right? That we're, you know, that is a sort of form of debility that the state projects onto us. And so I think the remake of the film, I think, was trying to not make it about indigeneity, but in the process sort of said something different, and I think really even more interesting about indigeneity, that, you know, the director of it is a French filmmaker, so maybe it took someone not from the United States to sort of accidentally have this realization too about indigeneity that I find really compelling. And there's another movie too that came out in 2013 that I've been wanting to talk about. It's called The Wind. And it's about this white woman out on the prairies alone with her husband. And she's sort of haunted, and it's actually a remake of like a really early silent film. And she's sort of like haunted by these invisible beings, these demonic beings. And of course there's no Native people in it, but the story is about her fear of Native people on the prairies. And so that's one of the really weird moves that I've seen several directors make, is like in order to try to make it not about indigenous peoples, they somehow expose how deeply these tropes are connected to how the state thinks about indigenous folks. So
that's just a really quick follow-up that was reminding me, because I saw The Wind and I was going to watch it on the streaming service, but then I was like, it's like this kind of frontier narrative, and I'm just like, I don't want to like have to think about this film right now. But when you were describing that, it kind of reminds me of like Little House on the Prairie, which I'll be honest, I've never read, I've only read the critiques
Me
of it,
either.
but there's always these narratives from, I can't remember her name. What is her name? The lady who wrote it.
Laura Ingalls Wilder.
That's right. About how her father would be like complaining about always getting removed from the land by federal troops because he's like literally squatting, and he's trying to hide from both the state as well as these hostile Indians, right? But it's never really like present. She doesn't really like fully identify, from what I understand in the books, like what the threat is or what the challenge is, even though they're talking about roughing it out in the hot, the rugged plains or whatever, building their sod houses and not bathing for days or whatever they do. I don't know what they do, but that's what it sounds like they do.
Weird stuff.
Yeah, weird stuff. Eating lutefisk or whatever it is. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really weird, and again, that's what I'm like trying to sort out in the book that I'm writing right now. Is where do these tropes like the final girl come from, or tropes of like the cannibal family come from, or tropes of the monster that's sort of an embodiment of nature come to take revenge, and are. Even though we supposedly, live in a time where people are friendlier or people are more aware of, colonization and its effects, that ultimately the stories that we're telling are pretty similar. And what does that mean about the fundamental core of some of these stories, and what do we need to change about that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was just gonna ask you about that. I'm really glad you brought up The Hills Have Eyes because no one ever talks about it. But it's supposed to take place on my land because it's it's about Los Alamos. It's about Los Alamos National Labs and creating these mutants, and it's so hilarious because there's the only white people that exist in the area are people who work at the labs and all those Operation Paperclip assholes who live there, and they're not poor, they're very rich. Los Alamos County is the richest county in New Mexico, and so it's funny that they had to create a mythical poor white class in this area, and instead of talking about who is actually impacted and all of the surrounding Native people. And then it's weird because then the backwater hillbillies become the stand-in for indigeneity almost. So it's if you can't talk about indigeneity, there's going to be some kind of stand-in like that. And likewise, like you said, with just the trope in general. So Nick's a Godzilla head, right? And Godzilla's the ultimate icon representing the outcome of nuclear colonialism. And we're always talking about The Happening. I don't know. I think that's a M. Night Shyamalan movie about
I saw that in the theater.
That, make people want to kill themselves because of...
It was actually good. I liked it.
That was a while. I feel like I was in high school, and that was one of those. It was that, and even though I love Sam Raimi, it was that and Spider-Man 3, where I was like, wow, movies can be bad.
So yeah, I mean this eco trope and in horror, I think it kind of reinforces the sentiment that humans are the problem, right? But then that leads us to ask the question, which humans, which people don't really think through, even when that trope is presented. So I was wondering if you want to talk more about that trope as it relates to indigeneity, because that one inherently always encompasses indigeneity because it's always about the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the whole thing about indigenous peoples, right, is that we have an inappropriate relationship to the land. We're either too close to the land, or we're not relating to it in the sort of workerly, we have to maintain it in a proper way sense. So the films that I've looked at are really old weird ones. These are the really old weird films before we started. That Nick was talking about. So one of the ecological horror films that I love to talk about all the time is this movie called Prophecy, from 1978, which I saw while I was in graduate school and was just amazing to watch the first time. And so in that movie, it's directed by John Frankenheimer, which is wild. And it's about this community in Maine. So we got the Maine connection again. And I think a lot of, Stephen King's writing about Maine and dispossession right around the time the Maine Land Claims Act is getting passed. And this is like right around that time too. So this is community in Maine. A paper mill has come in. They have poisoned the water supply by dumping mercury into the water supply, which what the film doesn't say is that the film talks about Minamata, Japan, which is where this first happened, and the effects of mercury poisoning on the body were first sort of made apparent. But what they don't talk about is Grassy Narrows and White Dog, which is where this was happening simultaneous to the production of the film and the novelization of the film, which is also wild. And so this white guy goes out, he works for he's going to, investigate to find out, is the mercury, who caused the mercury poisoning? What effects is it having? And there's this like giant mutant bear that has been created from the mercury poisoning. And its name is Katahdin, which is the name of not only a mountain in Maine, but also like a hero figure for folks out there. And basically Katahdin is this like woman bear, revenge of nature that is sort of acting on behalf of these, harmed indigenous people to take revenge on this paper mill. And the really weird thing about the movie, so many weird things about this movie. So it has Talia Shire in it too, from Rocky. And she comes along with this guy, her husband. She's pregnant and he doesn't know she's pregnant. So like already it's displacing the drama of this indigenous community being poisoned onto this like white settler futurity narrative. Like, are they going to get, infected with this mercury poisoning, and is their white child going to die? And ultimately, the white guy ends up saving the community, taking down Katahdin, figuring out all of this mystery, all the while sort of looking, using these primarily silent native characters as sort of specimens for his investigation. And there's one main native character, not played by a native guy, of course. The one other sort of special thing about this movie is that it does have one native actor in a pretty awesome part, called George Clooney, who's he's like the real deal. He was like a language revitalization guy. He like went to residential school, and then was a janitor and was like teaching dance and language in his former residential school. He's like an amazing guy. And he plays this sort of like, like noble savage character. But it just kills me every time I see him on screen, because he has like these huge, they paint everybody up and make everyone look stereotypical. And he shows up and he just has these huge glasses and like a hearing aid. And he just looks like the most uncleiest uncle that you're like, oh, my heart is so warmed. And initially when I first watched the movie, I thought the plot was going to play out that like this character was somehow like controlling the bear, like that movie, that show, the Terror. But he ends up getting killed by the bear, which was very sad for me. And so if I ever get to rewrite that film, that'll be part of the rewrites. But yeah, that film is just, it's that association of indigenous peoples with the land, so much so that, right, we like collapse into the land, that talking about land and indigenous people is talking about the same thing. And then talking about, how do we properly control catastrophe, because apparently native people aren't capable of handling it themselves. That it sort of perpetuates that white hero narrative in a weird way. And there's another other weird 70s movie I can talk about. I don't know. That's like the...
Let's hear it. I'm here for it all. I'm also thinking of our editor, Sina and Kyan, who will be hopefully pulling clips of these movies and putting them into this podcast.
Wow. So George Clooney was also in another movie the same year that Prophecy came out, playing like a very, very different character, and it was called Nightwing, and it's based off of a novel that was written by a native guy. And in that movie, is a little bit more interesting because it's like set on the res, and the deal is that the sort of corrupt, tribal president is going to mine out this sacred site. And so this character played by George Clooney is like, in order to protect the sacred site, I'm going to end the entire world, which is...
You killed our own people.
Yewa will keep the good Baskai out of the underground. The rest will have to die.
Where are the bats? Tell me, Uncle, where are they?
The flying animals are Yewa's messengers.
I can't let you kill everyone.
You're a good boy. You'll do the right thing.
I'm fighting you, Abner.
Don't fight me, boy.
I have to fight you!
I can sort of see his point, but sometimes, so he decides to put on the ceremony. He's going to end the entire world, and the tribal cop, of course, because there's always a tribal cop in all of these stories, sort of stumbles in on it, and then spends the rest of the film trying to like fix this curse that is put into place. And part of the curse that has been summoned is that there's these like rabies infected bats that come out from the sacred site. And it has the best scene, one of the funniest scenes I've ever seen in film, where it's basically like a recreation of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, but it's these like white people that come out to the res to like sightsee, and they're like out there singing Kumbaya or whatever around the fireplace, and then these bats just descend on them. And the son and the husband like book it into this van and just like close the van door on their mom while she's like being attacked by these bats. And it's like, it's true. It's like it makes a very true point in this depiction. And it's just like, that's another just like weird movie. And so I find that those two films really interesting because it's like the two tropes of indigeneity back to back, right? Where it's like the noble savage, like the person that's useful to provide information and then disappear, which is what happens to Emrai in Prophecy, is that he sort of passes on his information about the land to this white guy character and then gets conveniently killed, so that no one has to be accountable but to him, right? And then the other trope, which is like this bloodthirsty savage, right? That he's going to end the world, no matter what, at what cost, right? And I wish George Clooney passed away, and I just wish he was still around because I just want to ask him, like, what was it like doing those movies back to back? Because I'm sure he would have really funny stories.
It's kind of like reverse settler colonialism. It's like the native is going to end the world. That's the horror. You talk about in some of your other work, and I don't know if you have many thoughts on this, but the sort of like passing, like the totemic kind of like artifact that one gains, or like the power that one gains. Like I was thinking of like the X-Files one where like Mulder like gets buried and comes back alive. Like that's also like a very funny trope. I don't know if you have any like comments on that one.
Yeah, that happens in Prophecy. The big one is Poltergeist 2, right? Where, oh gosh, what's the name of that guy in Poltergeist 2? That is Craig T. Nelson, right? So Craig T. Nelson encounters Will Sampson, and Will Sampson is this like mysterious medicine man figure that's going to come, right, and help with the exorcism. And he has like a sweat lodge that he's built in this backyard, and he's like teaching his son, and it's like this weird, really bizarre narrative. And that's what happens, right? Is like Craig T. Nelson, like his journey in that movie is that he's struggling with the reality that he like failed to protect his family. And so what Will Sampson's character does is sort of like pass this information on to him so that he can help exercise, and it's again a captivity narrative, right? There's like a little white girl being held captive on the other side, right? It's all there. And so yeah, that's like the classic totem transfer narrative. If you want to go like weird esoteric versions of this, there's this hilarious 1977 movie called The Manitou, which is based on these really weird novels by this guy Graham Masterson. And in the movie version, it's like Tony Curtis, and Tony Curtis is like playing the hero, and he's like a little too old to be playing the hero, the dashing hero of this slasher movie. But in that one, again, it's a captivity narrative. It's about this medicine man named Misquamascus, which is actually a character taken from an H.P. Lovecraft text. And he, instead of sort of physically taking like a woman captive, he sort of internally takes her captive. So he like starts growing a clone of himself in the back of this woman whose name is Karen, so it's like perfect. And so Tony Curtis has to like go find this, of course it's always a medicine man. His name's Singing Rock. I think in the book it's stated that he's Lakota, but in the movie he's just like amorphous native guy. Of course, also not played by a native character. And so he has to, in that movie it's really strange too, because basically the conclusion is that they discover that they can summon the Manitou, the spirit of all of the machines in the hospital, and use that to fight against like the spirit of this, the Misquamascus, this like bad native spiritualist guy. But because, the spirits of machines are white man's medicine, that it takes, Tony Curtis, and then ultimately the woman Karen is the one who like summons all the spirits and like destroys the medicine man. And the last like 3 minutes is just like this psychedelic, like it's like that scene from it's that scene from 2001 A Space Odyssey where it's just like lasers and like lights, and like she's just shirtless, like shooting lasers out of her hands at this like Native American shaman. And again, it's that to round back to the totem transfer trope. It's knowledge from Native people is important to white people, but Native people are not. So, after, Tony Curtis's character and this character Karen get the information that they need from the medicine man to defeat this being, the medicine man just kind of like disappears, right? Just sort of, he gets in a cab and like drives off into the city and disappears. And so again, it's a way to have your cake and eat it too, to say like, we honor Native American knowledge, but we don't honor, having to work out good relationships with people in order to have access to some of that knowledge, right?
The best part of that story or that movie, which I haven't seen, but based on your description, is the fact that he gets in a cab and leaves, and he doesn't like ride off in his horse.
The city, though.
Yeah, to the city. Yeah. Yeah. So, we have some like final questions, and mine's kind of a complicated question. So if you need some time to think about it, that's fine. So I have a question about, what are your favorite films or stories that best represent like the nightmare of settler colonialism? And it could be like these bad films that we're talking about. And then also like, what are some of the films or the stories, we talked about Stephen Graham Jones, that are coming out by Native authors and Native creators, that you best think kind of personify Native horror as a genre?
Ooh, I just saw a movie that I was like, this gets as close to some of the, what was that? it's a horror movie that came out recently. I went and saw it and I was like, wow, this gets as close to like some of the WBing stories that I've seen, where it's just about like consumption. What was it? I don't know. I'll answer the question about native horror.
Okay.
I forget what it was. It was.
What's the plot?
Was it Antlers?
No. That one I did not like. It wasn't even about, what was it? It's like, it was about it was about some sort of scary consumptive person. It came out like this year, and I was like, oh, that's pretty close, but I can't.
Was it X?
No, X was good though. X was pretty good.
I mean, that was kind of about consumption. It was.
Oh, it was. Okay. That was it. So it was because it was so weird. So like a good one that got really close to like thinking about the self-destructiveness of colonialism was actually David Cronenberg's new movie Crimes of the Future. Where I got it and I was like, whoa, this is getting pretty close to like what Ojibwe stories about like cannibal beings, right, gets at. Because in that movie, the conceit of it is that, you know, pollution, some sort of catastrophic event has changed human beings so that they're like spontaneously growing new organs. And now there are like children growing up with these new organs that can eat plastic. And I'm like, oh, I was like, that gets really close to thinking about like the existential dread of creating a world, like having to cope with the reality of living in a world that you have fundamentally destroyed. And also, you know, the people who grow these spontaneous organs, have to have them removed because the idea is that if they have these new organ systems, are they human anymore? And so I think he was asking like really interesting questions about like, how do you make relations with beings that are like fundamentally different from you in some way and like an ethical way, which I think a lot of native stories ask those questions too. And then, yeah, like what does it mean to bring about, like to have to live in the destruction that certain human beings have wrought. So I really like, I mean, credit to Cronenberg. That is also a really weird film too. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but that was one of those where I left where I was like, okay, this is like getting at some of these ideas that I've seen in some of my favorite native horror texts. And then in terms of some of my favorite native horror texts, I have like a pile of, I don't know if I can show you all since we can see it, my giant pile of books that I have. I don't know, so I'll try to be quick or offer some that, you know, recently stood out to me. And one that I recently discovered that I hadn't encountered before that I want to give props to for a bunch of reasons is this book called Ghost Singer from a writer named Anna Lee Walters. And she is Pawnee and Odo. And this book actually came out in 1988. So it's before NAGPRA was passed. And it's basically this story, and it's kind of interesting too because she's Pawnee, but she's writing about Navajo characters. And basically this Navajo guy is working at the Smithsonian, and there's this like, because the Smithsonian has so many people and so much patrimony, it's just like haunted by these horrific beings that are causing all of the white people working there to commit suicide. And it's actually starting to harm this Navajo guy that's working there too. And so his community kind of comes together and tries to have a ceremony to kind of help what's going on, but like the ceremony ultimately fails. And to me, it's a really interesting novel because it's a novel about like NAGPRA and repatriation that comes out that predates, right, like 1992, the actual laws. So when I teach a class on horror and indigeneity, and I think I'm going to try to teach that one the next time I do it because it's timely, and I think it's a way to show, right, that these conversations were being thought about even before laws were passed.
That's like really fascinating, because it makes me think about how they invented songs and ceremonies for people who were drafted into the military or went to World War I, because they actually didn't quite, like Lakotas, for example. I know this from my research, didn't know like how to like bring back a spirit in fighting in a foreign country, because we never fought outside of our territory. And so they had to make up a ceremony. And from what I understand, because there was never just this massive theft of graves and ancestral remains, that it is not like they were inventing ceremonies, but they had to create like spiritual kind of protection and ways to like communicate with these ancestors, because of the genocide and the theft of people that took place. So that's like, and that was written in 1980. I'm writing a list, by the way. I'm going to read this.
Yeah, it's really, and I mean, it's interesting too, because it's thinking, I'm not Navajo, so I would be really interested to hear what someone had to say about like the representation, because it's one of those, like thinking across, like writing across like tribal difference, which I think is also what sort of makes it a fascinating text. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear, to read. Let's see, another one, Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians. I love that book. I think it's, again, one of those books that exposes, right, like the horror of colonization, because it's about these four guys who, short summary, it's about these four guys who one year decide to go into the elders only sort of hunting area on their res. They're Blackfeet guys, and they find this herd of elk, and they decide, okay, well, we're going to be the heroes, and we're going to kill all these elk, and then we'll get all the meat, and we'll be the heroes of the community for feeding the community. But they kill all the elk, they take more than they need, and then ultimately the game warden comes and catches them, and they have to dump everything anyways. And one of the elk that they kill is pregnant, and her sort of wrathful ghost comes back 10 years later to take revenge on them. It becomes a sort of slasher narrative. And I think what's terrifying about that book for me is that it is about the ways that settler colonialism and colonial society has made it seem like, indigenous peoples have like two options, right? You can either, suffer or die, right? You can either play the game or you can die. And so he's really careful in showing these flawed men who think that, their only option is to make these really bad choices for their community and for their kin, right? Because the elk are kin to the community, and you have to honor that relationship. But what he also does is sort of twist a lot of the horror conventions. There's a final girl in the narrative, and I won't spoil a bunch of it, but the final girl ends up making a very unusual choice that shows that there's, not just two options, there's like 3 or 4 or 5 options that you can make. And the terror is that, the culture we live in has reduced our imagination such that we can't even think about these options as options. And that's sort of embedded in like the form of the book. It's a really beautiful story. I just also read, if we're going transnational, I just read this book, Ghost Bird by Lisa Fuller, who's Woolly Woolly, which is an Aboriginal people from Australia, from what's now called Australia. And it's about these 2 twin girls, and one of the twins goes missing, and the other twin is sort of going out and figuring out, what happened to her. And one of the really interesting things that Fuller does is that she talks about a very specific cultural being, but she never names what it is. And I think that's if I think about, refusal a lot, like Audra Simpson's notion of refusal. And I think that refusal is really, really interesting in this book. And I want to teach this one too, because I think students that aren't Native are going to be frustrated. You're going to be like, why won't you tell us what it is? And it's a good lesson to be like, well, you don't, just like, in a Native community, not everybody gets access to all the information. It's like, you don't get access to this information. Welcome to the lesson. And it's sort of caught up in this plot about, like stolen objects, and that's why why people are disappearing. There's other Native women sort of tied up in this plot of disappearance. It was a really, really beautiful book. It was that, and then the last one that I'll share too. I have a bunch. I can list off a bunch of authors at the end if that's helpful. Is I read Ramona Emerson's Shudder, and Ramona is Navajo, and it is about a woman who is a crime scene photographer, and she's Navajo. But since she's a little girl, she's been able to see ghosts. And so when she goes to these crime scenes to take pictures, and she's also been able to capture on pictures like ghosts ever since she was little too. And so when she goes to these crime scenes, she encounters the ghosts of the people that were killed or murdered. And the story is her sort of trying to figure out the mystery of this woman who was killed. Maybe in an accident, maybe not, and also trying to manage the sort of experiences of being an outsider in community, because all the folks there just think she's a witch, and folks don't all the cops of course don't believe that she can like talk to these ghosts and encounter them, and the ghosts are also sort of deeply harmful to her. Like they hurt her body to have to listen to them and to encounter them. And it's just like a beautiful, beautiful novel. The beginning like goes hard. Ramona Emerson like can write gore like with the rest of them. It like goes hard. But it's a really, really interesting novel and a really interesting take on like the crime genre, which is also up until recently, and not a genre that, we can talk about like the dark water stuff, I guess, but not a genre that a lot of Native writers have written in so far. I can think of like a handful of other folks, but this was an interesting sort of like horror gore spin on it.
So I just have one more question for you, Kaylee. And it's also kind of a loaded question, but what do you envision for the future of Native horror? Like, how do you see Native authors and artists and screenwriters playing with these tropes and challenging these tropes, and maybe even bringing in some of our own tropes and figures? Are you kind of seeing any patterns up and coming in some of the literature you've shared with us?
Yeah, I'm really excited. I really can't wait to see, what stories folks are willing to share from their communities, because that's like my favorite part of being like the Native horror lady is when I go to events and I get introduced as the Native horror lady, is that elders will come up and be like, let me tell you about this Bigfoot story. And I'm like, yes, tell me, I want to know. This is my favorite part. And so I'm really excited I like and I appreciate the stories that are sort of reinscribing these classic horror tropes, sort of expose like the inner workings of them and how, strange and racist and colonial they are. But I really like also the stories that are grounded, in particular communities and particular figures. And those are like, when people share those with me, I think that's really special. I think, I think there's a really robust, a really robust Native literature in terms of, there's a really robust Native literary horror community. And unfortunately, there's not as much of that transferring into film yet because, films take a bunch of people to make. But, films like Jeff Barnaby's Rhymes, Free and Ghouls, like that's one of the films I credit with my my career is watching that film when I was in graduate school. And I think that film is still very special to me. I think, Loretta Todd's Monkey Beach is like also a beautiful film. I think an example of like bringing a community, like bringing a specific story into film. A really good example of that is Helen Hang Brown and Guy Evenshaw's Edge of the Knife. That's like one of the best movies ever made. And it's about this Haida figure called a Gagid, who's sort of this person who becomes transformed by, trauma that the community has to sort of restore through coming back together and through processing grief together. And so I'm really excited for more of these novels and stories to make it into film. In terms of trends that I'm seeing across texts, I don't know. I mean, of course, a lot of Native stories are written about like exposing the everyday, right? Like the quotidian horror of living under colonialism, that that for some the what if is a reality. I think maybe not in the story themselves, but in the community, it's really awesome to see folks sort of uplifting each other and making connections with each other and shouting out each other. And so I hope that continues as well. So, yeah.
So last request, if you said that you really like when people share horror stories with you, do you have a horror story that you would be willing to share with us?
I do. I mean, it is a horror story, and it's a horror story from my family, and it's a horror story from my dad, who's my white dad. But he told me this story recently that I'm like, whoa, if I could write, I would make this into a short story. So he was telling me a story about how when my brother was very young, before I was born, he and my brother went out hunting. My dad's like an avid hunter, fisherman guy. And they drove out and we're going to hike out to a spot to sort of spot for deer. And this is before cell phones. So all he had was like a GPS, and it was like a brand new GPS. So there were only like 3 or 4 satellites up. So it was still kind of all new, unreliable. And so they get out of the truck. My dad drops a pin for this where the truck is. And they set off, and it's cold. It's still kind of wintry, snow on the ground, and they hike out, and they post up for a while looking for some deer, and nothing comes along. And my brother, who's still pretty little at this point, starts to complain. He's like, okay, it's getting cold. He starts whining, and my dad's like, okay, well, we'll set up back and go back to the truck. And he pulls out the GPS, and it points him in a direction, and they start going, and he balks and starts realizing this is like the entirely opposite direction, I think, of where we're supposed to be going. And at this point, it started to rain. It's getting slushy and really cold. My brother, who's little, is like, well, let's just stop and make a fire. And my dad's like, no. My dad's also paramedic. And so he knows, like, they're in trouble because they can, freeze to death at this point, especially my brother. So luckily my dad takes out like a compass, a map. He also had that knowledge. So he figures out, okay, the road that we were going was like an east to west road. We came this direction, so we need to walk this direction, and eventually we'll hit the road. And so they walk back and keep walking, and eventually has to like pick up and like carry my brother back to the truck, but they make it back to the truck. And he said, that was like the most scared he's ever been in his whole life, because he was worried, not just about himself, about my brother. But that's just like the weird like technology shenanigans that were happening. I'm like, man, if I was like a creative writer, that's, it was something out there, messing with the GPS, and trying to make it so that they can come back. And I was like, whoa, that's a creepy story.
You know, that's no joke. I'm surprised more Native people aren't talking about how technology interferes with our lives.
And he's like, ever since, you know, I even when the GPSs got better, I would always have a compass, I would always have a map, I would always, you know, because after that one time, I was like, you can't. He's like, I can't trust it anymore. I was like, well, good. I'm glad that all worked out.
Well, thanks so much, Kaylee, for joining us. Real quickly, where can people find your work, and where can they find you online?
Yeah, so if you are an academic and have access to academic works, I've been published in the Science Fiction, Film, and Television, a journal. I have work hopefully forthcoming in the Routledge Companion to Horror that should be coming out soon. I also will have work coming out in a book on weird fiction where I'm talking about that weird movie, The Manitou. It's called The Weird, a Companion, that's coming out from Peter Lang. I have some public work. It's not about horror if people are interested. I've been writing the recaps for Reservation Dogs for the past two seasons on vulture.com. So if you want to hear me talk about, they have some horror episodes. If you want to hear me talk about those, check those out on vulture.com. And then I am also on Twitter posting nonsense at Simmons Kaylee. It's occasionally, long diatribes about colonialism, but mostly shit posts about whatever is happening to me that particular day.
Awesome. Well, this has been such a cool talk. I think this is going to be hit.